SAP S/4HANA is one of the most common ERP systems in the industry, but is it the right fit for you? Today I'm going to talk about an objective review of the pros and cons and advantages and disadvantages of S/4HANA. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent and tech-agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And one of the common systems that we help our clients, especially in the upper mid-market and the enterprise level, to evaluate is SAP S/4HANA. In many cases, we're helping clients figure out if it's the right time to move to S/4HANA. In other cases, we're helping them implement S/4HANA. And in some cases, we're helping them recover an S/4HANA implementation that has failed or is in trouble. So what I want to do today is talk about what some of the pros and cons are of SAP S/4HANA, where it's a good fit, where the weaknesses are, and what types of organizations and situations it's best suited for. And my goal here today is to provide you a balanced and objective view of those pros and cons. And even if you do decide that you want to implement S/4HANA, it's important to recognize and understand what the deficiencies and weaknesses are of the product and where the risks are so that you can plan for that more effectively. Now, if you'd like to learn more about how to make your S/4HANA implementation successful, I encourage you to read our guide to SAP S/4HANA implementations. It's an objective and tech-agnostic view of what makes S/4HANA implementation successful. You can find that by scanning the QR code right here or the links below. And it essentially summarizes some of our experiences and lessons having worked with so many clients throughout the world in helping them with their S/4HANA implementations. First, it helps to understand what exactly SAP S/4HANA is. And if you're familiar with the SAP ecosystem and SAP's history, you know that some of the legacy systems included SAP R3, which is probably 20 to 25 years old or more. And then you have SAP ECC, which is what most customers are migrating from when they move to S/4HANA. And S/4HANA is, of course, the most recent flagship product that SAP has developed. Some of the unique aspects of S/4HANA are centered around the architecture and the database that it's built on. The HANA database is a real-time, in-memory database that allows for processing transactions faster and processing data faster, which really helps with analytics and transaction time and performance time for the technology. There's 3 different flavors of S/4HANA. So just because you've decided to move to S/4HANA doesn't necessarily tell you which flavor of S/4HANA you're moving towards. There's the traditional on-premise version of S/4HANA, which less and less customers are migrating to, and SAP is beginning to support that product less and less. And then there's 2 different cloud versions of S/4HANA. One is a private cloud instance, which is where we see most of our clients moving. And a private cloud is essentially taking the on-premise version of S/4HANA and having it hosted in the cloud. And then the third flavor of S/4HANA is S/4HANA public cloud. And public cloud is essentially the multi-tenant SaaS version of S/4HANA. And this is where you have multiple organizations using essentially the same version of the software with their own databases running the data that's specific to that organization. So you have 3 different flavors, and the most flexible of the 3 flavors is going to be the on-premise version, followed by the private cloud version, followed by the public cloud version. The public cloud version is, generally speaking, less flexible than the other 2, but those are the 3 main flavors of S/4HANA that you have to choose from. In addition, it's also important to understand some of the hosting options you have with S/4HANA. You can have SAP host the solution yourself, or you can choose your own hyperscaler, whether it's AWS or one of the other major cloud providers. Some of the other things to be aware of as it relates to the SAP S/4HANA ecosystem is going to be BTP, which is SAP's business technology platform, and essentially the platform that they've built the applications on. And this allows you to have some level of flexibility to where you can create extensions from S/4HANA to customize the software outside of the core. And this is why SAP pushes so hard for a clean core, because they have the BTP that allows you to have these extensions and customizations you can do outside the core S/4HANA system. And then there's also Joule, which is the AI tool, including agentic AI across workflows, across the entire S/4HANA suite. And then another term to be aware of is RISE with SAP. And RISE is the way that SAP is bundling software subscriptions along with implementation services and hosting options. So it's a way for you to have a one-stop shop to handle all of the technology needs that you might have for SAP S/4HANA. So that's some of the real basic high-level definitions of SAP S/4HANA, but what I want to do next in the rest of this video is get into the advantages and disadvantages of the product. Perhaps the biggest strength that S/4HANA has is the maturity, the business process integration and technology integration, and the scale of the solutions. SAP has been around for a long time, for over 50 years now, so they've had a lot of time to develop deep capabilities in a number of industries, particularly in manufacturing and complex manufacturing. That seems to be an area that they're very strong in, especially amongst our client base. In addition, the technology and the business processes are very integrated, and that's been SAP's strength for decades now, is they provide a single solution for the most part, although you have add-ons with Ariba, SuccessFactors, and other SAP-owned systems that can extend the capabilities of S/4HANA. But generally speaking, S/4HANA is a fully integrated ERP system that allows technology integration and business process integration across end-to-end workflows. And the reason so many large Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, and large complex global organizations are using S/4HANA and SAP in general is because it is such a scalable product. It's built for large, complex organizations with high volumes of transactions, complex business needs, diverse business needs, global operations, global regulatory and tax compliance needs. All those sorts of things have been built over decades to help the largest organizations in the world scale. So that's one of the biggest strengths of S/4HANA, is that if you're a large organization, a multinational, there's very few systems that can scale to the extent that S/4HANA can. I mentioned a moment ago how one of the biggest strengths of S/4HANA is the scale and the integration and the maturity of the product. But on the flip side, there's a dark side to that, and that is that there is a lack of flexibility at times. When you compare S/4HANA to, say, Microsoft Dynamics 365 or more flexible products in the tech space, it's clear that S/4HANA is just not as flexible. And for some, that's not a bad thing, because they want to standardize their operations. They want to have a common operating model using a common platform, a common set of technologies and tools. And for them, it makes sense. However, that can lead to a lot of pain organizationally and operationally, because you're forced to change to accommodate or to comply with the way the software was built. This makes change management a lot more difficult and user adoption a lot more difficult. And because it is such a big product that can handle such diverse needs for some of the most complex organizations in the world, by definition, that means that the product itself is fairly complex. It's difficult to implement, and it can be challenging for organizations to adapt to that complexity. However, if you're already an SAP ECC shop, that learning curve is going to be a little bit more palatable. If you're moving from a completely different platform to S/4HANA, it can be extremely difficult and disruptive. Not to say you shouldn't do it, but it's just a risk to be aware of. But generally speaking, this complexity and relative lack of flexibility can be challenges for a lot of S/4HANA customers. Because S/4HANA is a complex product that can do a lot of different things, it means that by definition, the implementations themselves are going to be complex and risky. Even if you're already using ECC, moving from ECC to S/4HANA has some advantages and some learning curve adoption benefits, because it has the similar SAP look and feel that you might be used to internally. But still, it's an entirely different architecture. It's an entirely different platform rewritten for the cloud. And for that reason, S/4HANA implementations are oftentimes a lot more complex and risky and costly than organizations recognize. So the key here is, again, not to suggest that you shouldn't necessarily implement S/4HANA, but to suggest that it's probably going to be riskier than you think. It's probably going to take more time and effort than you think. And it's more important than ever to make sure you have a clear phase zero or implementation plan early in your S/4HANA implementation before you ever get your system integrator involved, to make sure that you have a clear roadmap for what it is you want to do, how you're going to staff the project, make sure you mobilize your resources, and then bring in the consultants to help you start building technology after that. I would say the biggest unspoken disadvantage of SAP, and something that a lot of industry analysts and certainly people in the SAP ecosystem don't talk much about, is the fact that it is very difficult to find a positive ROI or business case for S/4HANA, especially if you already have ECC and you've built a lot of customization and a lot of travel knowledge is built into that ECC instance. It's really difficult to justify the investment you're about to make to move to S/4HANA. Now, of course, SAP and other industry analysts might tell you that, hey, you're removing technical debt, you're making yourself future proof, you've got more modern technology. Those are all fluffy, intangible, unquantifiable benefits. And if those things are really important to you, then maybe it does make sense. But I've yet to see a single customer that is on ECC that has been able to prove a positive business case to move to S/4HANA, especially when you incorporate the realistic time and cost associated with the implementation. Of course, if your system integrator gives you a understated implementation budget, it might be a little bit easier to prove an ROI or to suggest there is a positive ROI. But the problem there is that more often than not, the implementation proposals that we see for S/4HANA are completely underestimated. So when you actually add a dose of reality to those implementation costs and timelines, it's very difficult to prove the ROI. Now, if you're moving from a non-SAP product, or if you are decades behind in your technology investments, and this is your first major upgrade in, say, 20 or 30 years from something other than SAP, then it might be a little bit easier actually to justify the ROI. It may be that this is such a big jump and such a quantum leap of potential improvement for you that there is a positive ROI, but I would submit to you that in that case, the risk is higher because you are making such a big jump from a, say, a pre-Y2K type of enterprise mainframe system to now S/4HANA. That's a big jump for a lot of organizations. So the risk might be higher, but you might find an ROI if you have a really outdated system. But generally speaking, it's been very difficult for the SAP customer base to justify moving from ECC to S/4HANA. And so you just want to make sure you understand fully whether or not you're doing this for measurable business value or if you're doing it for other more strategic reasons. One of the bigger long-term issues that I think needs to be examined amongst SAP customers is the commercial lock-in risk as well as regulatory scrutiny that SAP is facing. Let's start with lock-in. With the RISE program that SAP has rolled out, they've made it on one hand very easy or relatively easy for you to bundle all of your subscriptions, all of your implementation costs, your cloud hosting costs into one single contract to make it easier for you to make that move from ECC to S/4HANA. On the other hand, what that does is that locks you in. You are more locked in than ever in an S/4HANA environment than you might have been in an ECC environment. The switching costs are going to be a lot higher when you decide someday potentially to move from S/4HANA to something else. Now, this is true for a lot of different cloud vendors. This isn't unique just to SAP or S/4HANA, but generally speaking, S/4HANA entails more lock-in and more vendor lock-in risk than other types of past SAP products you might have worked with. The other thing to keep in mind is that there is regulatory scrutiny happening, particularly in Europe, the EU, and UK. There is antitrust allegations and investigations happening in the EU for third-party maintenance and support, and some of the tactics that SAP is using to try and prevent customers from using third-party maintenance and support. And there's also a lawsuit, I believe it's in the US actually, that entails Celonis suing SAP for blocking Celonis's ability to do business process mining within SAP because SAP has their own business process mining tool that they want customers to procure and use. So keep an eye on that. I don't think it's at risk of putting SAP out of business, but I do think it's a reflection of some of the tactics that SAP is using to try and convert more of its customer base to S/4HANA and trying to, in some cases, limit options amongst its customer base. So another risk to be aware of, it may not be a deal breaker for you, but you should be aware that vendor lock-in is real and the risk of that is real, and some of the regulatory issues and the legal issues that SAP is facing may affect how SAP operates in the future. So at the end of the day, where does S/4HANA best fit? Well, it's a very viable product. So many big organizations use S/4HANA, and even more big organizations are using ECC, which means there's going to be years here where big organizations are making that move from ECC to S/4HANA, which means there's probably a pretty bright future in the short to intermediate future for S/4HANA and SAP in general. There's a very large ecosystem that supports SAP. That's another big strength of the product. So finding qualified SAP resources is generally not difficult. They are fairly expensive or relatively expensive compared to other ecosystems we work with at Third Stage Consulting. But generally speaking, you're going to be able to find those resources. I do wonder if those resources will become increasingly spread thin over time as more and more organizations make that jump to S/4HANA. But for the time being, you can find the resources that you need, whether it's through a system integrator, through a staffing firm, or through the open market, or all of the above. So where SAP S/4HANA is the best fit is going to be organizations that meet any one or more of these criteria. One is you're already an SAP shop. You're already using ECC or maybe even R3. Again, it's going to be a re-implementation. It's still risky. It's going to be more costly than you think, but it's probably less costly and less risky than if you were to move to an entirely different platform outside the SAP ecosystem. Secondly, if you're a complex organization, you're multinational, you have diverse operations, if you're deep in manufacturing, you've got very complex manufacturing operations, you have global regulatory needs and global tax needs, SAP is probably going to be a good fit for you, and there's probably not many other solutions out there that can handle those capabilities in the same way that S/4HANA can. And then another type of organization that we see thrive in an S/4HANA environment are going to be very asset-intensive organizations where they're spending a lot of money on procuring, investing in, and maintaining and repairing large capital purchases, whether it be machinery or fleets and equipment, whatever the case may be. That tends to be where SAP thrives. So those are the types of organizations where it's a good fit. Where it's not as good of a fit is if you're not a large, complex organization, or if you value flexibility over standardization, that might be pointing you towards something other than S/4HANA. If you're already using, say, Oracle or a legacy Microsoft product, it may be that looking at one of those upgrades within that ecosystem is going to be less costly and risky for you than making a bigger switch to S/4HANA. So those are some instances where S/4HANA may not be a good fit, but for a lot of organizations we work with, it is a good fit when they meet the other criteria I mentioned. I hope this has given you a balanced and objective view of what some of the pros and cons of S/4HANA are. If you'd like to learn more about S/4HANA and what it takes to make an S/4HANA implementation successful, be sure to read our guide to S/4HANA implementations. You can find that by scanning the QR code right here, or go to the links below. And if you are in the S/4HANA community, whether you're a consultant or a user or an executive that has implemented or is implementing S/4HANA, I'd love to hear your feedback too. What's your experience with S/4HANA been so far? What would you add to the conversation here today? I'd love to hear your comments below. So I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day. SAP S/4HANA implementation is successful. Try that again. Is that because? Okay. Independent tech agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys.